welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Mary, and today's video is going to be my wrap up for the month of March, and I'm going to do it as I get ready with me again. So I've already gotten ready, obviously, but I'm here to just give you my stats to start this video off, and then we will jump into the reviews. In the month of March, I did end up reading 16 books. I'm only going to give you stats for 10 of them because 6 of them were part of the same series. It's the Pretty Little Liars series. I completed that series in the month of March, so I will link my videos where I discuss that series in depth if you would like to see them. But now, without further ado, let's get into the stats of the 10 books that I am going to tell you. So I did read one book physically. I read 8 books via audiobook, and then I read one book using a mixture of physically reading it and an audiobook. As far as ratings go, I had 4 3-stars, 4 4-stars, and 2 5-stars this month, which is pretty good. I also got all of the books that I read this month from the library, so I am trying to read my own TBR. That's not great, but I already sort of anticipated that that's what it would be. I wound up DNFing a book as well. I will talk about that when I give my reviews of books. I read 3 YA books, 4 adult books, 1 new adult book, and 2 classics that I don't really consider either. I think one of them is technically a middle grade or YA, and the other one is technically YA or adult. At least my library has them shelved in those places, but we'll get to those again when we get to them. I read from 3 male and 7 female authors this month. I read 6 books by white authors, 2 books by black authors, and 2 books by non-black POC authors. I read 1 book published in 2018, 1 book published in 2020, 4 books published in 2019, 1 book published in 2021, 1 book published in 2022, and 2 books published in the 19th century. I read 2 nonfiction books, 1 contemporary, 2 general fiction / literary fiction books, 1 romance, 1 sci-fi, 1 fantasy, and 2 classics. I also read books from authors from 4 countries, 2 in North America, 1 in South America, and 1 in Europe. So those are my reading stats for the month. And now let's just jump back to Past Mary and give you some reviews. Let's just get into the books that I read this month and how I felt about them. So I did just want to start with explaining the Pretty Little Liars books. I'm not going to go in depth, obviously, because I made 2 hour-long videos about it, so if you want to watch and hear my full thoughts on the 16-book series, I will link those for you so you can watch that. But I did just want to now finally talk about the books that I read. So I read several of those this month. I haven't calculated exactly how many I read this month yet, so I'm going to do my stats later, and then I'll film that portion separate from this, but you will have already seen that. But all of those books, I didn't rate any of them as I read them, and I don't think I'm going to rate them now. They feel like pretty much anywhere between a 2 and a 4-star. There were some that I enjoyed more than others, and I do wish that I had kept better notes on how I felt about the books individually, but I was so focused on doing a review of the series that I didn't do that. So, but yes, I did finish that series, so I'm very happy about that. Next, I want to talk about the book that I DNF'd. First, I'm going to grab some eyeshadow. I DNF'd a book this month, which I don't always do. In fact, I usually don't, and this is a book that I was listening to as an audiobook, so it's even more rare that I will DNF an audiobook, just because I find audiobooks really, really easy to read, or I guess listen to. They don't take that much of my time, and I'm pretty much always listening to an audiobook because I just like to have something going when I'm like cooking, cleaning, walking to class, driving to work, whatever it is. I DNF'd The Man Who Walked Away by Maud Casey, which is a historical fiction, and I believe it's actually based on like a real guy's life or diagnosis or something. But it's about this man who one day in the middle of the night just starts walking, and he can't remember anything about like why he started walking. He doesn't really remember who he is. He forgets everything except for walking, and he walks all across Europe until he gets placed in the sanitarium in Paris, I believe, or in France somewhere, probably not Paris. But he gets put in the sanitarium, and then the other part of the story was told from the perspective of a doctor in the sanitarium, who I assume if I had listened farther, the doctor would have like figured out what was wrong with the guy, and they would have like, it would have been about that relationship. I did not get to that point. And I'll tell you why. It's because in the like less than 100 pages that I read, this guy who walks around masturbated at least 3 or 4 times. And it was just, I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to read about that. I just didn't think, I don't know. I didn't need the details of it at any point really, but like especially past the first one, I was like, okay, you already did this. So I know. So for me, that just really, I just didn't like it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if you did. enjoy this book. I think it has a pretty low rating. It's a 3.32, so it seems like most people didn't enjoy it. I don't know if I would have ended up liking it more if I kept going, but I just didn't feel like I would. I knew there was no way I was going to love it, so I gave up. The next book I want to talk about is a nonfiction that I read, and that was Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders by Tomas Chomorro-Premuzic. I don't know. It's an Argentine author. This book it was really interesting, I will say. I gave this book 3 stars. I liked it, but I didn't love it, and also I didn't find it informative enough for what it was claiming to be, and I didn't find the ideas in it were explored enough within the book. I'm sure in this guy's research he did explore, but the book did not give us enough context to make me feel like this was really well researched, and I'll explain a little bit about what it's about. So the background of this guy is that he is a therapist or a psychoanalyst or whatever, and he lives in this area of Buenos Aires, which is known to be the highest, or known to house the highest number of therapists and psychoanalysts per capita. And it's because everyone who is in that job has to have a therapist or a psychoanalyst in order to be a therapist or a psychoanalyst. So every time there's a new therapist, another therapist gets more clients, and so there's always this need for it, so they just have a ton. It was really interesting the way he explained that. He grew up there, and he, of course, because he grew up in that area, always wanted to be a psychotherapist, because that's what he always saw, psychoanalyst, and so that's what he does. And he talks a lot about behavioral economics and stuff too, which I think is really interesting. He had a lot of really interesting ideas, and he talks a lot about how the main reason that men are often leaders whereas women aren't is not because men are more capable of being leaders, but it's because men house these traits more often, like confidence and the way that they portray themselves is something that we see and we think of as leaders. I wish he had done more acknowledging of the fact that it's probably because men have been in the workforce a lot longer than women have traditionally, hundreds of years longer, and because of general sexism in our daily lives. The whole idea that the man is the head of the household, so naturally the man would be the head of the business. He didn't really go into the sociological reasons for why men are often in leadership roles, unquestionably, whereas if a woman is in a leadership role, we tend to question it more. But what I thought was really interesting about this book, and what I did really enjoy about it, I promise I'm going to get to the point on these, is that he talked about how a lot of times when we're trying to tell women how they can get into leadership roles, we are asking them to adapt traditionally, quote-unquote, masculine male traits, right? So masculine traits like confidence, a little bit of narcissism, stuff like speaking out instead of being quiet, and we're asking them to drop a lot of the things that would actually be really beneficial to have at a leadership level. He talks about the difference between IQ and EQ, and how women have typically higher EQs, emotional intelligence, and that is actually more important for leadership roles, but we don't often use that as a way to determine whether someone should be a leader. We just find out once someone is a leader, if they have a lower EQ, they're a worse leader. He also talks about how a lot of men are in leadership roles, but how many people hate their boss? Almost everyone. And whether your boss is a man or a woman, most people dislike their boss, but it's because to get to be the boss, you have to adapt these traits that are negative in leadership roles. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And his whole argument is that we should be not necessarily having more female leaders, but we should be encouraging more quote-unquote feminine traits of emotional intelligence and trying to get those people into leadership roles because they are more successful as leaders. And he quotes a bunch of studies. So I thought that was a really interesting book. Again, I did think it was a little all over the place, as you can kind of tell from my description of it. I'm being a little all over the place, but I did like that book, but I did not love that book. The next book I want to talk about is a book that I struggled with what to rate. This was realistically a 2.5 star, but I do think about it a little bit. And it's The Parking Lot Attendant by Nafkote Tamirat. I apologize if I'm saying that wrong. But it's about this girl who is an unnamed protagonist, and when we start out, she and her father have just joined this commune as the newest members. It's like an island community, and the island community really doesn't want the girl there They don't really seem to care about the dad, but they don't want the girl there, and we don't really know why. And then we go back in time and we learn a little bit more about her, and I will admit, I still don't really know why they don't like this girl. So that was one of the problems I had with this book. But we go back in time, and the girl's never named, which is something that I think is really cool. I will say, just as like a preface, this book did a lot of really cool things, in my opinion, and had a lot of really lofty goals. Whether it accomplished all of those goals, I'm not entirely sure, but I did really enjoy most of the process of what was happening in this book. So essentially, we have this girl who is being raised by her father, and she hasn't seen her mother since she was little. Originally, her dad abandoned her and her mom, and then when her dad came back, her mom abandoned her, and her dad had to come and, like, be her dad full time. So that's, like, her backstory. She's in high school when this book starts, and she's Ethiopian. Her and her father are both, I think she was born in the States, but her dad is, like, from Ethiopia. And there's a big Ethiopian community in Boston, and there's some, like, sort of shady stuff going on behind this one guy who is a parking lot attendant. And the gist of what he's doing is he is selling more parking lot spots than are legally allowed. So that is, like, the basis of this con that he is running. And as you get to know him more and more, you get to know more about the different cons that he is running. And you get to know that because the teenage girl gets to know that. And we just sort of watch her, like, she's looking for attention because her dad doesn't really give her the right amount of love. And so we're watching her try to figure out who she is, figure out why, like, it feels like nobody really wants her. And we're just sort of watching this. It's not really a downward spiral in the way that you would, like, think of a downward spiral, but it definitely is very much this, like, struggle to find belonging and trusting the wrong people, doing the wrong things. And also, I will say, this book was very much a case of adults not treating a child like a child, which happens all the time. But what I will say is, this book, I did not always know what was happening. I think the author had a lot of lofty goals to have this all, like, line up and set up what was going on. I don't think it all connected. I think I figured it out, like, what it was supposed to be, but I think the author jumped steps in their head because they knew what was supposed to connect, if that makes sense. So that was my frustration with the parking lot attendant. I wanted to like it a lot more than I actually ended up liking it, but it's such an interesting concept. And I'll leave it at that. The next book that I read is a new adult contemporary romance, and it's actually a new release from this year. So it's called Good Girl Complex by Elle Kennedy. It's my first Elle Kennedy. I think other people I've heard have read stuff of hers. I gave this 3 stars. I liked it. I didn't love it. I had a fun time reading it. I would consider reading the next one. I think it's going to be like a series of books that are all set in this area. I imagine the other one will follow. The, like, male love interest has a twin brother, so I imagine he's going to be the focus of book 2, but I don't really know. It could be someone else. I'm not sure. So this follows this girl who, when she was in high school, started this, like, not tech company, but she, like, started a website that's kind of, it sounds a lot like a Reddit, like something that would be like a Reddit page, subreddit or whatever, but it's called Boyfriend Fails, and then she expands it to also have a sister website called Girlfriend Fails, and basically people just post their funny stories and she makes ad money off of it, right? And so she's a self-made millionaire, but her family's also really, really rich. And she's been dating this guy since she was in prep school. And her parents basically have the whole thing is that her parents have her whole life planned out for her. And she's always been a good girl and gone along with it. But then she meets this guy when she moves away to this college town that's, like, half the college town is full of really rich people and the other half is full of, like, working class people who just work in this town and basically work in tourism. And she starts falling for this guy who is on the poor side of town. That's literally the thing. He's, like, a bad boy. And basically, if you read After by Anna Todd, not 100%, but it's kind of similar because, like, at the beginning of the book, she has a boyfriend, and then she gets with this guy, and it's different because in After by Anna Todd, the boyfriend literally, at least in the movies, I didn't read the books, the boyfriend literally did nothing wrong. But in this one, the boyfriend sucks. So it's about, like, her coming to terms with her relationship with this guy, but it's also about her trying to figure out if she's okay with, like, disappointing her family and having her family treat her as an adult. I, again, liked this book, didn't love it. I thought it was really predictable, which isn't a bad thing because it's a romance, but I don't know. It didn't feel that original to me, and it felt a little hard to buy into at times. Next book I read was The Toll by Neal Schusterman. I won't talk too much about this in depth because it is the final book in a trilogy, but it's the last book in Arc of a Scythe. I enjoyed it. I liked it the least of all the books, I think, and my problem with this one is it had too much going on and too many timelines going on, and in this world, they name the years after animals and not after, like, numbers, so there's really no way to keep track of the timeline, or at least I did not find a way to keep track of the timeline. So that was hard and, like, confusing, and I didn't like, but, you know, I was satisfied with where the series ended up. I didn't expect it necessarily, but I was, like, not bummed by where the series ended up. But all in all, I just didn't think it was that strong of a conclusion to a series that I really enjoyed, especially because I think book 2 was my least favorite before this, and book 2 took me a really long time to get into, but this one I was into right away. Like, from the beginning I was hooked, and then it just sorted, like, the reason it was jumping timelines is so the reader wouldn't learn things before the author wanted us to learn things, but that just made it confusing for me. So personally, didn't love it. I would recommend the series if it sounds interesting to you, but I don't think it's anything, like, amazing. And I feel like it got really hyped reviews when it first came out in, like, 2018, but in my opinion, it did not live up to the hype. Then I read The Kingdom of Back by Marie Lu. This starts where the books that I really, really enjoyed. This is a, like, YA fantasy set in, I don't even know, whenever Mozart was a kid is when it's set, because it follows Mozart's older sister. And Mozart and his sister used to travel along around Europe, and they would play music together as child prodigies, but Mozart was a better child prodigy, and also, since he was a boy, he was allowed to write his own stuff. And this book sort of gives, like, a fantasy twist on their story, where the sister writes most of Wolfgang's stuff. She calls him Wolfroll. That's what I was calling him that. Which I think is actually kind of cute. No offense. Kylie should have kept that name for her baby and called him Wolfroll. That would have been adorable. Anyways, sorry. So she also writes music, but she's not allowed to. And she gets in trouble from her dad, and there's, like, all this stuff going on. It's really a coming-of-age story about her, but in the book, obviously, we follow her finding this, like, not really portal world, but she finds another world that her and Wolfgang go to with this fairy, and the fairy wants to, like, he, like, promises that he'll help them become famous musicians or never be forgotten if they help him with these 3 tasks. A very familiar type of story, but it's really about them coming together as siblings, and it's about her coming to terms with where her life is going to be. And so at times, I'm not going to cry talking about this book, that's ridiculous, but I didn't love the whole process of reading this book, which is why I didn't get a 5-star, but I just thought I was very touched by the way that the author encompassed the feeling of, like, being left behind and being forgotten, and the sacrifice that she makes for her brother to have the career and the life that she wanted, because she couldn't have it. And I really liked it. I recommend it. Next 4-star we have is The Weight of the Stars by K. Ancrum. And this, I really enjoyed as well. It's described as YA sci-fi. I'm not gonna lie to you, it's basically YA contemporary, but it's set in an alternate timeline where we've just got a lot farther in space travel than we have in this timeline. It does talk a good bit about space, but it's mostly set between like home and school of this girl. So the premise is one of the girls, like the main character, her parents died in some accident, and they used to work for NASA, but NASA is now a part of the government, and so instead of being like just for science, it's part of like the military, I think. And this girl and now her brother has a baby, and she is like kind of the ringleader of a group of misfits at school. So when this new girl comes to school, she's like invited to be the new girl's like friend. Like her teacher comes up to her and is like, hey, I know you're friends with all these other misfits. Could you be friends with this misfit too? And I disliked a couple of things about this book, which is why I didn't give it 5 stars. I ended up really enjoying the ending of it, but I had a really hard time liking the beginning, just because the way she goes about becoming this girl's friend is like bullying her, kind of. And I just don't think I would ever, like the way my personality is, I know I would never be friends with someone who treated me the way that she treats this girl, even if later it was like, haha, friendly fire. Another thing that I like really didn't like about this book is not the book's fault, but the blurb gives away everything that happens in the first half of the book, but it does it out of order. So the blurb leads you to believe that certain reveals happen after certain parts of action, when really the reveal happens, like, it's like the first thing you learn about this other character. So if you are going to read this, I would recommend not reading the blurb, or like not taking it too seriously. So that was something that I like found really annoying, because the blurb sets up this like one course of action of what you think the conflict is going to be, and then the way the reveals happen, that's not the conflict. So that was annoying to me, but I did really like it. I just was disappointed by this book because everybody loves it. I've heard so many people say this is like a 5-star book for them. They thought it was amazing, and you know, it did make me emotional at the end, but it just wasn't 100% like my favorite thing, I guess. I think I had too high of expectations is what happened, but I would read more from Incompetent, and I do want to read, I think her other book is The Wicker King, so that's something I do really want to read. The next book that I read, I listened to in an evening, pretty much, while making, I was meal prepping some stuff for the week, and it's a collection of short stories called Sing to It by Amy Hempel, and this book was so good. There are 2 stories in here that I like absolutely loved. My favorite story, and it's the one that I'm going to tell you about, is this. It's called Full Service Shelter, and it's about, I need to finish doing my makeup or I'm gonna lose my mind. It's about this woman who is telling stories about living or working at this animal shelter, and like what it was like and what the type of people who work there were, and just the way she wrote it. If you're an animal lover especially, oh boy, it made me cry. It was so sad. But yeah, I really liked that collection, and I would definitely read more from Amy Hempel as well. Her short fiction is really, really good. The next book I want to talk about is another nonfiction that I read, and that is Autopsy of a Crime Lab by Elle Garrett. It's written by an attorney who I believe does a lot of work in like criminal stuff. I don't really know that much about Elle Garrett, I'm not gonna lie to you, but he's written a couple of books like this. And the book basically goes into debunking all of these myths that we have about how solid forensic evidence is, because forensic evidence is not actually that solid, and a lot of it is still like a fingerprint is still circumstantial evidence. I don't think a lot of people realize that. But like DNA can be, if you have like a solid enough amount of DNA, it can be like the best way to get evidence. But if you only have like a tiny, tiny bit of DNA and it only shows like a certain strand, he has this one thing where he talks about this guy got convicted because they said that like his DNA matched the DNA that they found, but they didn't explain that like 1 in 16 black men would also have this strain of DNA, because that's what that strain is. Like, it's just a common strain. And so this guy got convicted on DNA evidence when the evidence wasn't as solid as they make it seem, and experts are allowed to portray evidence as not being as solid as it is. And there were even cases where like the judge wouldn't let a defense attorney ask about error rates on certain tests, which is just bonkers to me. So I read that. That was recommended to me by my, I'm taking criminal procedure adjudications right now, and that's one of the things that we talked about, sort of. He actually recommended that we listen to this podcast that another professor in my law school does. It's called Excited Utterance, if you want to listen to it. But they interviewed the author in the podcast, and so we were supposed to listen to the podcast, but I wanted to read the whole book because I just wanted to. And I did really like it. I do think it focuses a lot on fingerprints, specifically because there's this one really famous fingerprint case about this terrorist incident that happened in Spain, and they matched a fingerprint that was in CODIS in the United States. They matched the fingerprint to a guy who was an attorney who had recently converted to Islam in Colorado, who had never been to Spain. And he was telling the people, like, I didn't do this, and they had this whole, like, case against him where they basically said that he used these fake documents to get to this place. They didn't have any evidence of any of this, because it didn't happen, but that was their, like, case against him. And then Interpol actually, or Spanish authorities, I can't remember, they actually reran the tests, and they found that the prints matched a known terrorist living in North Africa who was in Spain at the time. So we are always taught that fingerprints are unique, but we're also always taught that snowflakes are unique, and there's only like 16 or 18 types of snowflakes. So it's just really interesting. And he also talks about like the jury perception of evidence and forensic evidence, and how like, because of the way that it's presented on shows like CSI and Criminal Minds and all this stuff, people sort of think that forensics is like hard science when it's not at all. And it's usually not even developed by scientists. Like fingerprinting was developed by police departments who do not have science backgrounds. So it's just really interesting. So that's a book that I do think is like, I think it's a fascinating read if you want to like turn your head upside down, especially the amount of coverage it goes into on like misconduct in labs and the lack of training needed to be a lab technician and handle this type of stuff. Like, I feel like on CSI, it always looks like it's someone who's like double PhD, like MD, whatever, doing their thing, when really it's like, you know, a high school graduate who has like minimal training, who's just like running a lab test. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with being a high school graduate. I'm just saying that we need to alter our perception to understand what actually is happening. Because even like people who have MDs, PhDs, whatever, make mistakes. But I just think we just have this perception that lab techs are like really, really well trained when that's not the case. And again, isn't it crazy what a difference eyebrows make to a face? So the last two books that I read this month were Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And Jane Eyre I gave 4 stars. Little Women I gave 5 stars. And I did have a reading blog where I talked about both of these books, and it'll either be the video directly before this, in that case I will link it, or directly after this, and in that case it'll be the next video that comes out, so subscribe to my channel or you'll miss it. And I talk about both of those more in depth in that vlog. But I'm starting a new series, or I started, I guess, a new series. Sorry, I'm trying to put this mascara on. I started a new series where I'm going to be reading books based on my favorites list of last year in an attempt to find new favorites. But this one seemed to be pretty successful. Again, I gave Jane Eyre 4 stars and Little Women 5 stars. So stay tuned to that vlog to figure out my complete thoughts. But I'm gonna go do my hair and get dressed, and then I will film an outro for this video. Okay, thank you so much for watching this video. That is it for this monthly get ready with me / wrap up. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. You can also subscribe to my channel if you would like to, because I do post 2 videos every single week, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!